Good. Okay, so it's
yeah. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, you just heard a little bit of a preview of our incredible speakers this evening. It is so wonderful to have you all here. I am Daniela Hofscher from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre. Tonight is the third and final installment of our incredible event with Posen Library and the Kaplan Centre, the Jewish Culture and Civilization. Tonight's talk is by Professor Samuel D Kassow, Jewish Writing During the Holocaust. We're very excited to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us here. I know it is very cold here in Johannesburg. We'd love to know where you're coming from. Are you having a wonderful youth day? If you are here from South Africa, how did you spend your youth day? For everyone else around the world, thank you for joining us again. This has been a beautiful series. We've learned an incredible amount, and it is such an honor to be working with the Posen Library and the Kaplan Centre again. Now, if you'll give us just 2 more minutes to let in our audience, we're expecting quite a large audience this evening. So if you would just bear with us for a few moments. I see that Mervyn is joining us from Johannesburg. Hello, Mervyn, lovely to have you joining us again. It's so wonderful to have our audience here. And thank you if you've joined. If this is your first of these 3 sessions, there are recordings available on our YouTube channel of the first 2, or if you've been with us all along the way, welcome back, and we're so happy to have you. I will ask just everyone to please keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation. If you do have questions, and we of course encourage questions, write them in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you. And we will begin again just in a few moments. I do hear, if everyone could please just keep their microphones off. I do hear some background noise, not a problem at all, but please, especially when our speakers are talking. So again, this is Jewish Culture and Civilization, our third and final event in this series. Sorry, I think I can hear some people. I'm just going to mute you for now. Thank you. Again, if you do have any questions or concerns, please, you can write them in the chat. So this is our final event in the series Jewish Culture and Civilization with the Kaplan Centre and the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. Our final event, Jewish Writing During the Holocaust. We're so glad that you've all managed to join us. It is Youth Day here in South Africa. It is freezing here in Johannesburg. We'd love to hear from when you're all joining us from. We do have a large audience, but we will begin in just 1 minute. If you have not been with us for the other 2 events, we do have recordings available of them. If you have been with us this entire time, thank you, and welcome to the final event. Thank you for sticking with us. We know this has been a very insightful, interesting, and enriching program, and we're very sorry to see it end, but I have no doubt there will be more collaborations coming. So we'll just take 1 more moment and then we will begin. Again, please just remember, for housekeeping reasons, to keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. If you do have any questions for our incredible speaker this evening, please write them in the chat. And the session is being recorded, so you're more than welcome to keep your video on if you're okay with having your beautiful faces shown to the public. But if you would prefer for them to be hidden, you are more than welcome to turn your camera off. So I think, as we let people in, I think we are going to begin the session. So again, hi, I am Daniela Hofscher from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre. Welcome to the third and final installment in our series Jewish Culture and Civilization with the Kaplan Centre and the Posen Library. Tonight's talk, Jewish Writing During the Holocaust. I would like to introduce first Adam Mendelsohn. He is the director of the Kaplan Centre in UCT and an associate professor of history at the University of Cape Town. Adam, thank you so much for joining us through all of these sessions and for being a wonderful moderator and guiding force. Over to you.
Thank you, Danny, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final session of our three-part series, that highlights the extraordinary riches of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. As Danny has described, this series has been organized as a partnership between the Posen Library and the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre. Our first presenter in this series was Professor Deborah Dash-Moore, who spoke about the emergence of Holocaust consciousness in the decades after World War II. Last week, we heard from Professor Ken Moss, who spoke on Polish Jewish reckonings with danger and powerlessness in the 1930s. And tonight we are absolutely delighted that our presenter is Professor Samuel Kassow, who will speak about Jewish writing during the Holocaust. All three of our presenters are editors of volumes that appear in the Posen Library series. But what exactly is the Posen Library? This short video provides a taste of what it contains. If you have not already done so, it is definitely worth spending time on the Posen Library site, where you have access to many of the wonderful documents which the library makes available. So our speaker this evening is Professor Samuel Kassow. He is the Charles Northam Professor of History at Trinity College, and the author of many studies of Russian and Jewish history, including Who Will Write Our History, Emanuel Ringelblum, the Warsaw Ghetto and Onyx Shabbos Archive, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2007. The book received the Orbis Prize of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies and was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award. He's also the co-editor of Catastrophe and Rebirth, 1939 to 1973, volume 9 of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. This volume explores Jewish perceptions of the momentous events of the mid-20th century and how Jewish people around the world redefine themselves in the face of tragedy, displacement, and dispersion. Thank you very much, Professor Kassow, for speaking to us this evening.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to talk to an audience in South Africa. I've been to the country a couple times, and it's been a wonderful experience. And of course, the Posen anthology underscores the centrality, the salience of the anthology as a form of expression in Jewish history. The Bible, the Talmud, the Siddur, the Haggadah, all the way to modern anthologies like the Jewish Catalog. The anthological form has played a critical role in Jewish culture. Anthologies are a flexible form that introduce new ideas. They undermine old paradigms. They facilitate diversity and dissent. And especially in the period of Volume 9, 1939 to 1973, the Jewish world was turned upside down of the Holocaust, the establishment of the State of Israel, the destruction of East European Jewry, the rise of the United States as a major Jewish center, huge cultural shifts. All of this is reflected in our anthology. And of course, a major theme in Volume 9 is Jewish cultural expression in the Holocaust. And so the first slide is an anthology that was compiled in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940 by Antek Zuckerman and Eliyahu Gutkovsky. Antek Zuckerman became a leader of the Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. In 1940, Jews still had no idea of the final solution. The Germans had not yet made a decision to actually murder European Jewry, but Jews were already being persecuted. They were being herded into ghettos. And at this period of terrible crisis in Jewish history, Zuckerman and Gutkovsky prepared an anthology of readings from Jewish history, from the biblical period all the way to the present time, to remind Jewish youth, and this anthology was aimed at Jewish young people in the Warsaw Ghetto, to remind Jewish youth that Jewish history is a story not just of persecution, but of resilience, of survival. We survived the Romans, we survived the Crusaders, the Cossacks. Let's learn from our past so we could survive this too. Both Zuckerman and Gutkovsky were secular Zionists, but they followed in the footsteps of the great historian Shimon Dubnov, who said, maybe I can't believe in God, but I can certainly study Jewish history and learn about the greatness of the Jewish people. So history, as it were, becomes the religion of the secular Jew. And this anthology really highlights the critical role of cultural and spiritual resistance, not just armed resistance, but spiritual resistance as well. Okay, next slide. Now, as this anthology in the Warsaw Ghetto was becoming an object of study in the youth movements across the ocean in the United States, an American Jew, Leo Schwartz, was putting together a very different kind of anthology entitled Memoirs of My People. Memoirs of My People is an anthology which asks new questions and calls for new conversations about Jewishness. At a time of supreme crisis in Jewish history, the first news of the mass murder in Europe is already beginning to filter through. What Schwartz is saying is that we need to look at the Jewish past and the Jewish present, not just through the prism of books and ideas, but through the prism of individuals. We have to think about stories of Jewish men, women, children, the lives they led, the questions they asked, how they loved, how they coped, how they endured. In the foreword to this anthology, Schwartz was saying, I am looking, and I'm quoting now, I'm looking for the hot burning heart of the Jewish people, the stories of individuals and not just the collective. And a major theme in what Schwartz calls this burning heart of the Jewish people is this theme of Jewish resilience and Jewish resistance. Okay, next slide. This slide shows Abba Kovner testifying at the Eichmann trial in 1961. In the Vilna ghetto in New Year's Eve, 1941, 1942, when Abba Kovner was only 22 years old, he was an up-and-coming Hebrew poet. He was a leader of a Zionist youth movement called Hashomer Hatzair. He would later gain fame as a leader of Vilna partisans, and then he moved to Israel, where he became a leading figure in Hebrew culture. But on that New Year's Eve in December 1941, Abba Kovner read a manifesto. In this manifesto, Abba Kovner says that the Germans intend to murder the entire Jewish people, and we have to resist. We have to fight back. If we don't have guns, if we don't have pistols, we have to fight back with culture. We have to fight back with spiritual resistance. This is literally the first time in Nazi-occupied Europe that a Jew is saying that the Nazis intend to wipe out the Jewish people and that the Jews have to draw their conclusions from that. This was 3 weeks before the Wannsee conference that took place in Berlin in January 1942. How did Kovner know that the Nazis indeed planned to do this? He had no way of knowing, but he had an intuition. And he used his charisma, he used his gifts of expression to inspire his audience. And he writes, among other things, what can we do to defend ourselves? We're helpless. We have no possibilities of organizing any defense, but we must defend ourselves with all means. Moral defense is the command of the hour. Next slide. In Krakow, a young Jewish woman, Gusta Davidson Dranger, was sitting in a death cell in a German prison. And as she was awaiting execution, she wrote a journal on toilet paper, and that journal survived. And in that journal, Gusta Davidson Dranger talked about the key role played in the ghettos by the youth movements. Just as Abba Kovner was in a youth movement in the Vilna ghetto, just as Antek Zuckerman was a leader of youth movement in the Warsaw ghetto, Gusta Davidson and her husband were part of a youth movement in the Krakow ghetto. And it was these youth movements, Zionist youth movements, Bundist youth movements, that functioned as the pillars of Jewish resistance. The one reason they were so important is because these young people trusted each other. They had formed these parallel families. They did not have the obligations of looking after their parents because their parents were already dead. They did not have children. And so they could think about coming together to fight back. And in this particular passage, Gusta is talking about what she called the Last Supper, a dinner of all the young people who came together for one last time before they dispersed to forests, to hideouts, to bunkers, and none of them survived the end of the war. Shortly after Gusta finished this journal, she was executed by the Germans. But in this document, she says in part, I feel that this is our last communal Kabbalat Shabbat, our last communal ushering in of the Sabbath. We will have to leave the ghetto. This week, we will start dismantling our cozy corner at number 15. Another phase of our life will be over, but we must not regret anything. This is the way it must be. And by the way, her husband, Shimshon Drenger, who was also murdered by the Germans, wrote in his own journal, "What are we fighting for?" Now, he knew that the Jews had no hope of defeating the Germans, and fighting was not a means of surviving the war. They had no illusions that they would survive. But he asked the question, what are we fighting for? And the answer was, we're fighting for 3 lines in history. We're fighting so that people will remember the Jews fought back. Okay, next slide. The anthology, of course, also pays a lot of attention to the thoughts and role of religious Jews in the ghetto, religious leaders during the Holocaust. And one of the greatest examples of Hasidic thought, of Hasidic leadership, was Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapiro, the kisechner rebbe, as he was called. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, he gave weekly sermons to his Hasidim, which were written down and which survived because they were hidden in the secret archive of the Warsaw Ghetto that was organized by Emanuel Ringelblum. And at the beginning of the war, the kisechner rebbe, like many other Orthodox Jews, as he asked himself, why are we being persecuted? Why are we suffering? He believed, like other religious Jews, that this is God's punishment for our sins, for assimilation, for all kinds of backsliding from the commandments of the Torah. But in 1941 and 1942, as things got steadily worse, the kisechner rebbe began to believe that this is not just the repeat of previous disasters in Jewish history, the first and second temples, for example, but this is something entirely new. This is unprecedented. And then he goes back and asks the question, why are we suffering? Where is God? And the answer to that question that he begins to develop in the Warsaw Ghetto is that the Jews are dying, they're suffering not because they sin, but because they're soldiers in a battlefield, defending God, defending the Torah, in a war that the Nazis are fighting to create a godless pagan world, that the Jews are fighting in defense of the Torah. Just as on Purim, they were in danger because of their sins, on Hanukkah, they were also in danger, but not because they sinned, but because they were defending the Torah against the Greeks. And this is the position that they are in now in this battle against the Nazis. Next question, next slide. This extraordinary woman, Susana Ginchanka, was murdered by the Germans in 1944. I'm haunted by the memory of this amazing poet. She grew up in the Yiddish-speaking town of Rovna in Volyn. Russian was the language spoken in her home, but she embraced Polish culture, Polish poetry, and by the 1930s, she became one of the rising stars on the Polish literary scene. But of course, as you can see from her picture, she looked very, very Jewish. And for a time, she was hidden by a Polish woman who hid her in exchange for money. And then when the money ran out, she turned Susana Ginchanka over to the Germans. And Susana Ginchanka wrote this amazing poem, Non omnis moriatur. It's a poem about the reason why so many Poles, including her landlady, turned Jews in, because they wanted their possessions. And in this poem, from beyond the grave, Susana Ginchanka indicts this Polish woman who denounced her. And she says, among other things, so let your hands rummage through Jewish things, you Chomensreif from Lvov. you mother of a Volksdeutscher. May these things be useful to you and yours. For dear ones, I leave no name, no song. After the war, this poem was used as evidence in a trial where this woman who denounced Ginchanka was brought to justice. Next slide. Now, Avram Sukskiver became one of the best-known poets, not just of the Holocaust, but then one of the great poets in the state of Israel, where he settled after the war. Sukskiver came from Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Ginchanka wrote in Polish, Sukskiver wrote in Yiddish. Sukskiver faced death many, many times, but somehow he believed in the worst days of the ghetto that in the face of death, a beautiful poem, it has some lasting value, some lasting significance, that the Germans might kill a human being, but they can't kill a poem. When his little baby boy was murdered one day after his birth, Sukskiver wrote a poem. When his mother was murdered, Sukskiver wrote a poem. He later said, when the very sun became like ashes, I believed with perfect faith, as long as poetry does not abandon me, lead will not destroy me. As long as I live my life as a poet in the valley of the shadow of death, my sufferings will merit tikkun, they will merit redemption. And so in this anthology, we include some of the poetry of this amazing artist. Next slide. Now, in the ghettos, one of the most important forms of expression was song. And this is a song composed in the Vilna ghetto by Leah Rudnitsky, Stremlen Vögel auf die Zweigen. Birds are drowsing on the branches. And of all the forms of cultural expression in the ghettos, none was easier, none was more accessible than singing. You could sing anywhere, you could sing by yourself, you could sing with someone else. And in the constricted space of the ghetto, songs spread at warp speed. After the war, the Vilna poet and partisan Shmerka Kaczerginski wrote, in ordinary times, such songs would have taken a long time to gain popularity, but in the ghetto, we witnessed a wonderful process. Individual creations became folklore before our eyes. Every newly created song, which expressed the feelings and experiences of the masses, was at once taken up by everybody. The bloody events themselves were the creator of folklore, and songs spread not just within the ghettos, but within various ghettos and camps. Deportees from Vilna who arrived in the Riga ghetto or Stutthof interacted with Hungarian and Polish Jews who learned the songs that were composed in the Vilna ghetto. And one of the reasons why these ghetto songs had such emotional power was the contrast between lyrics and tune. Lyrics describing hunger, fear, mass murder, but they're set to tunes that come from pre-war lullabies, like Rojinkes mit Mandlin or Afen Pripyatchik, and the clash between those pre-war memories of home, of hearth, of stability, of love, conveyed by the tune, and the present reality of destruction conveyed by the words. These made these songs exceptionally powerful. Okay, next slide. Anne Frank, what has made us Jews different from all other people? Now, 1 million Jewish children were murdered by the Germans, and probably no one became better known or more famous than Anne Frank because of her diary, which was translated into 60 languages and sold 25 million copies. But for many years, the image of Anne Frank that came down to us was the image of a happy, optimistic young woman who, even in the face of danger, never lost her faith in mankind. Quote unquote, in spite of everything, people are really good at heart. And this kind of whitewashed image of Anne Frank in many ways was shaped by her father, Otto, who wanted to play down her Jewishness and to stress the universal message that good will triumph over evil. But with the appearance of an authoritative edition of the diary in 1986, we're reminded that this is a sanitized story, and that Anne wrote a lot, which really did not make an impression until relatively recently. For example, I just want to quote an excerpt that appears in the anthology. This is what she writes in 1944. Who has inflicted this upon us? Who has made us Jews different from all other people? Who has allowed us to suffer so terribly up to now? It's God that's made us as we are, but it will be God too who will raise us up again. If we bear all this suffering, and if there are still Jews left, when it is over, then Jews, instead of being doomed, will be held up as an example. Who knows? It might even be our religion from which the world and all peoples learn good. And for that reason, and that reason only, do we suffer now. We can never become just Dutch or English. We will always remain Jews, but we want to too. God has never deserted our people. Right through the ages, there have been Jews. And I can go on, but you see this is a very different image of Anne Frank than what the world came to see in the 1950s. Okay, next slide. Gustave Yaretzka met her death with her two young children in Treblinka in 1943. She was a stenographer in the Warsaw Judenrat, the Warsaw Jewish Council, but also a member of the secret archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. And Emanuel Ringelblum asked her to walk through the streets of the ghetto at the height of the roundups, when the Jewish police were rounding up 7,000 Jews a day for the cattle cars. He believed that her Judenrat employment pass would save her from being picked up. And he asked her to write down everything she saw. And she wrote this amazing essay. And she said, you know, we Jews were led to believe through our culture and education that the story of mankind is a story of progress, from savagery to barbarism to decency to humanity. How could we have known, as we watched the Germans murdering children on the street, that it's just the opposite? It's a story of regression. History regresses from decency to savagery. And then she writes, if this is in fact true, if the direction of history is a regression towards savagery, then I hope that my writings will be like a quote unquote, a stone under history's wheel, a stone under history's wheel. What does she mean by that? That even if she dies, and someday, if somebody discovers those writings, they'll read them and they'll say, oh my God, how can we have allowed this to happen? Let's make sure that such a disaster never takes place again. Shortly after Yaretzka wrote this, as I said, she and her two children were taken to Treblinka, but the writings were buried in time capsules, you might say, that were hidden under the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, and that were discovered in two caches, one in 1946 and one in 1950. The example of the Ringelblum archive is one of the most successful examples of cultural resistance. The Germans thought they would win the war. They would decide how the Jews would be remembered. As one Jewish historian said just before he was murdered, what the world remembers about murdered peoples is usually what the killers choose to say about them. But Ringelblum said, no, even if we die, even if we don't live to see it, we will bury time capsules, and one day they will surface, and people will remember us on the basis of Jewish documents and not German documents. And Yaretzka's essay is a major example of what you might call Ringelblum's posthumous victory. Next slide. Now, Itzik Thefer, in many ways, is not a very sympathetic character. He was a leading Yiddish poet in the Soviet Union. He was also an informant for the NKVD. He informed on his fellow Yiddish writers and poets, but that didn't save him from sharing their fate when Stalin murdered him and many other writers and poets and Jewish leaders the night of August 12, 1952. But during World War II, when the Soviet Union had its back against the wall and desperately needed all the support it could get, it reached out to Jews around the world. It allowed expressions of Jewish nationalism and Jewish pride. It sent Thefer and the great Yiddish actor Shimon Michaels to the United States in 1943 to propagandize the Soviet cause. And here you see Thefer and Michaels meeting Albert Einstein in the United States. And as part of this opening to Jewishness and Jewish nationalism, Thefer was allowed to write a poem called I Am a Jew, radiating Jewish pride. The zeal of the Maccabean heroes still seethes in my rebel blood. From all pyres, I have announced I am a Jew. I am a Jew who's drunk from Stalin's magic cup of joy, blah, blah, blah. Now, when Thefer was arrested in 1949, even though he'd been an informer, he had been badly beaten up and badly tortured. And meanwhile, the great African-American singer Paul Robeson, who was a communist sympathizer, came to Russia to give a concert, and he wanted to see his old friend Thefer. And the secret police said that Thefer will be glad to meet him, but he needs a few weeks because he's on vacation. They spent those few weeks giving him food, making him look better, fattening him up, getting rid of some of the bruises. And then he met Robeson in a hotel room, and he told Robeson, of course, there were microphones in the room, that he was feeling great, everything was fine, but at the same time, he made eye signals to show Robeson that he was in great danger. And as I said, he was shot in 1952. Okay, next slide. Bidrush Freitas was a Jewish artist in the Theresienstadt ghetto, and he was murdered by the SS in 1944. The Theresienstadt ghetto is remembered for its amazing cultural life, but we should not get too carried away. In between the concerts and the plays, 34,000 Jews died of starvation and disease, and 87,000 were deported to the death camps. But Theresienstadt served a dual purpose. On the one hand, it was a transit point for Jews on their way to the death camps, but it was also meant by the Nazis to be a propaganda showcase, a convenient location for famous Jews who enjoyed special protection. So the Nazis would invite international commissions like the Red Cross to visit Theresienstadt. They also made a movie about how happy the Jews were in Theresienstadt, using the famous German director Kurt Geron, who some of you might remember from The Blue Angel. Bidrush Freitas was part of a group of artists that the Nazis ordered to make facades for these propaganda purposes. But these artists covertly and secretly began to draw pictures of the real suffering of the Jews of Theresienstadt. The SS got a hold of these pictures, they arrested him, they tortured him, and he was murdered in 1944. But this is a reminder of the way that artists were able to resist Nazi oppression. And some of these paintings, as you can see, survive. Okay, next slide. Charlat Salomon was a German Jewish woman. She came from a very cultured upper middle class family in Berlin. She attended art school. She was murdered in 1943 in Auschwitz. She went to the gas chamber immediately after arrival. But before she was arrested by the Germans, she found herself in the south of France. And in the face of constant danger, she created a masterpiece, which was called Gouache from Leben. This is a gouache, and the masterpiece was entitled Leben oder Theater ein Singspiel, Life or Theater and Operetta. These were hundreds of autobiographical gouaches and commentaries, which was the single largest project undertaken by a Jewish artist during the Holocaust. It's a unique combination of life writing and art that bore witness to all that Salomon had seen and experienced. She chronicled her own life, the emotional trauma of her mother's and grandmother's suicide, the suffering of a young woman in a fraught relationship with father, the fear of being picked up by the Nazis. And amazingly, these drawings survived. Charlat Salomon didn't, but these drawings survived, and they're now being held at the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. Okay, next. The tragedy of June 1st and 2nd, 1941 in Baghdad. How many of us know, how many of us would guess that in the 1930s, Baghdad had as great a percentage of Jews in its population as Warsaw or Vilna? There was 35 to 40% of Baghdad's population was Jewish. And while we often hear about how wonderfully cozy Jews and Arabs were before Zionism, how nice Arabs were to Jews before the establishment of the State of Israel, this is a reminder that that story is not necessarily true. On June 1st and 2nd, a terrible pogrom broke out in Baghdad where 180 Jews were killed, 600 were injured, many women were raped, 1,500 homes and stores were looted. And the anonymous essayist is turning to his fellow Iraqi Jews and saying, shouldn't we learn our lesson? Stop trying to ingratiate ourselves with the Arabs. Let's think about getting a homeland of our own. This, of course, this anonymous writer was very much a Zionist. By the way, this and the next slide reminds us that we make a real effort in our anthology to encompass the entire Jewish world. We include Tunisia, Iraq, as well as South Africa, Australia. This next slide is by Paul Gez, who was a member of the Jewish Council that was established in Tunisia. in 1943. In 1943, the Germans invaded and occupied Tunisia, and they subjected the Tunisian Jews to terrible persecution. The SS actually sent an officer, Walter Rauff, to try to figure out how to send the Tunisian Jews across the Mediterranean to the death camps. But of course, the logistics were impossible. But nevertheless, the Jews were put into labor camps. They were subject to terrible suffering. And Gez, in this essay, 6 Months Under the Boot, is describing his experiences as a leader of the Jewish Council. And it's very, very compelling reading. Next slide. One of the aims that we set ourselves in the Posen anthology was to highlight an important genre of Jewish expression called life writing, memoirs, autobiographies. In a period of such destruction, in a period where so many Jewish communities were uprooted, it was life writing and reportage that conveyed the immediacy of individual experiences, the myriad way that Jews as individuals understood and acted out their Jewish identity. And one example is the autobiography of Pua Rakovsky, who wrote My Life as a Radical Jewish Woman in 1942. She was already in Palestine, but she was writing about her tumultuous youth. She was one of those East European Jewish women who was a rebel. She was a tough, no-nonsense, courageous feminist. She was forced by her religious parents to marry a man she didn't love. After giving birth to 2 children, she left her husband. She struck out on her own. She devoted her life to fight for the rights of Jewish women, to establish schools so that Jewish women could get a decent education. And after she arrived in Palestine, she also began to call out the hypocrisy of the Zionist movement, which paid lip service to women's rights, but all too often, most of the time, power was in the hands of men, while the women were expected to prepare the hummus and tahina and keep the pitas warm, but were denied any meaningful place at the table. And so these are very interesting memoirs. They're written in Yiddish, and they're a very important part of our anthology. Okay, next. In 1942, at the height of the Holocaust, a Hebrew writer named Chaim Hazaz writes a brilliant short story called The Sermon. And as desperate Jews are yearning more than ever for a Jewish state after the war, Hazaz is asking some tough but necessary questions, the same questions he's going to ask David Ben-Gurion a few years later. And he asked Ben-Gurion, what good will a Jewish state be if we forget the diaspora, if we forget the traditions we developed over 2,000 years? There's a danger that we have a state, but we cease to become a nation. And Hazaz was very worried that Ben-Gurion was dismissing 2,000 years of diaspora history and celebrating the new Jew, tough, proud, and self-reliant. And Hazaz was saying, it's not just the new Jew and the Sabra, it's the Talmud, it's Yiddish, it's the traditions that we developed in the diaspora, which we cannot forget. And in this short story, Hazaz's character, Yutke, is asking a nagging question. What if this country is fated to take the place of religion? If it's a grave danger to the survival of the people? if it replaces an enduring center with a transient center, a solid foundation with a vain and empty foundation, and so on and so forth. So these were very, very important questions. I'm going to have to stop here. There are a few slides I can't get to which deal with American Jewry. Suffice it to say that in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, with the destruction of European Jewry, there were many intellectuals and Jewish leaders who were in despair. What will take the place of the great Jewish centers of Europe? American Jewry is not qualified to do this. It lacks the spiritual depth. But in the anthology, we have examples of how American Jewish thinkers, Horace Callan, Salo Baron, Elliot Cohn, are stepping up and saying, no, American Jewry can assume the leadership of the Jewish people. And this would have been the next few slides that I would have shown, but unfortunately, we've run out of time. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kassow, for that rich presentation, giving us a real sense of the wonders contained within the anthology that you edited. And I know you have to leave now, so we won't have time for questions, but I think this we will happily have you back, hopefully sometime soon, to speak about this anthology, but also about many of the other topics that you have worked on. So thank you so much on our behalf, and thank you also to everyone who's participated in our series. It's been a wonderful opportunity for us to get a sense of the Posen Library and to hear from wonderful speakers, including Professor Kassow. So thank you so much to everyone.